Hello and welcome to FI for Kids, a podcast about guiding your kids on the path to financial independence and extraordinary lives. I'm your host, Dominic Delacqua. Our guest today is Skyler Fleming, podcast host of Money Talk with Skyler Fleming, a podcast about financial literacy, financial independence, and above all, the importance of talking about money and moving beyond our deeply ingrained social habits to not discuss finances and money. Welcome, Skyler, and thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm always excited when I get guest appearance opportunities because it's fun to chat about money.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, so let's start with a little bit of your background and how you found your way into discovering your passion for talking about money.
Yeah, so I think it's probably 5 years ago at this point. It was kind of one of my first real jobs after high school. I started working at a credit union and a call center and worked my way up to a tier 2 supervisor. So that meant I got the people who wanted the supervisor's supervisor. I got those level of calls. And so many times those people would come just completely irate or confused, frustrated, angry. And a simple money conversation or a money talk would kind of talk them down off of the like crazy ideas that they were getting going. So it made me realize that just a simple conversation, even just like you and I do, we're trying to get ahead of people's questions and offer advice before they really need it. Those kind of conversations can help alleviate so much stress in people's lives. And even after the fact, once people start having money headaches, that's where I was like financial coaching, things like that. The podcast that I do has such a huge value because simple money talks money touches every part of our life. So if we can just start talking about it, we're going to clean up a lot of different stressors in our lives.
Yeah, for sure. I think anybody who's a parent and is an adult and has all the responsibilities that go along with that, I think is aware money touches all aspects of our lives. But it's still a good reminder because as you get busy with things, it's easy to sort of forget that, it really does. I mean, money isn't everything, but it's such an important tool and it really does make a big difference. So I think that's a really good point. So what kind of questions were you getting from people?
It was all sorts of things like, why is my auto loan have a late fee? Like they just didn't understand the payment terms, or how do I avoid credit card interest because they didn't know what a statement balance was, and how you can actually still use a credit card to build credit without actually paying for interest. Because so many times the common myth out there, and of course this is likely pushed by banks and credit unions that want to make money off you, is that you have to carry a balance. And that balance that you're carrying is income in their pocket. And they just don't understand. Like I would say, let's log into your app. I'll show you where the exact number is, because more often than not, they would have 10, 20, $30,000 in their checking or something, plenty of money to cash flow their credit card, but they would be carrying a few $100 balance because they thought it was a good thing to do. And they would call in. And that was one of the things where my knowledge in my position would allow me to mention it to them. And that's where it can be so helpful to be proactive or be teaching people about finance, because I would offer that information to them. And who knows, I may have saved them hundreds or thousands of dollars in the rest of their lifetime by teaching them you don't have to pay credit card interest. So looking for those opportunities was really fun. But those were kind of the main things, is people just really didn't understand how debt worked fully.
Wow. And those are pretty basic things. So just, which I guess really just reinforces your point that the idea of financial literacy and not growing up so many of us not talking about money just has ramifications that trickle down. And like you said, right, over time can add up to thousands of dollars in money just frittered away, basically flushed down the toilet.
Yeah. And if you were to flip that money around and invest it, like if you really started to get optimized with what you could do on the other side of that, it could become hundreds of thousands and things like that. So there's so much opportunity in finance that it's almost become like a moral obligation of mine to talk about it. Like I got to teach people about this because there's just so much opportunity.
Yeah. So when you were growing up, did you talk about money as a kid at home? Is that something you learned about or not so much?
Not so much. I think I guess I witnessed more than I was taught. One of the main things that I witnessed as a kid was my parents would send me or my sister into the gas station with just a $20 bill, and however much that got them that much gas. They never really filled it. So for me, that one of the main memories I remember is saying, I want to make sure there's at least enough in my checking account that I can pay for transportation to get to where I want to go, whether it's a ticket for a train or things like that. Like I want to make sure I at least have the ability to move freely with my money. And that was one of the things that I witnessed. And I also saw my parents struggle with money, like asking grandparents for money, things like that. So it kind of just put into my mind an example of some of the things I wanted to avoid. And then thankfully I was put in a position at my credit union job where I was able to just expand and learn so much more from just different areas. So I more witnessed it than was actually like talked to and taught about it.
Yeah. So then you kind of became self-taught, right? Starting off
Mhm.
with your work at the credit union and kind of moving up from there. And at least my experience with people that I know that have worked in banks, and so I assume this is true with credit unions, is that it's
Mhm.
actually a good place if you start off there, that you can work your way up in that industry. Is that something that you did? Did you have a background school wise, or did you just sort of work your way up from working there?
Yeah, it was, completely entry level, worked my way up from just being there and just learning on the job, and I think that's where a lot of those call center positions can start, is you don't need a massive amount of knowledge. They'll teach you the basics, they'll teach you how to run their systems, things like that, and you can work up in those positions, and as you work there, you just learn and learn a lot more, and I attribute a lot of my financial education to YouTube as well, which is,
Sure.
kind of funny to say, but there's so much education out there from, like, podcasters like us, YouTubers, all sorts of different media areas have good people teaching good things about finance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the great thing right now, is that there's so much information available that it's easy to go and learn things. So, and
Mhm.
I hadn't thought about this before, but as we're talking, and this show's focus for parents, and then sort of later teens, early adults. So, if a family has kids that are looking for maybe getting their first job, if they have an interest in something like that, getting a job in a bank or a credit union could
Mhm.
be a great way to start to learn about money, become involved in that world. And then if they've got parents that are trying to help guide them towards financial independence in the first place anyway, then they can all have conversations together that could really sort of add a lot of benefits. So that's just something I hadn't thought of before we were talking about it.
Yeah, and even as you say that, like you mentioned getting a job while their first job at a bank or credit union or things like that. I almost, as I'm thinking, and I'm obviously biased because of my money background, but I don't know if there could be a better entry level job in terms of the just general world knowledge that it gives you about finance. And I mean, customer service is a great skill to have,
Sure.
but also just the hands-on experience you're going to have. I helped, like, business accounts that had tens of hundreds of millions of dollars in their account, and I helped people who we're getting $500 in overdraft fees and everything in between there.
Yeah.
So I've seen, like, all the financial situations, maybe not done everything as far as like an advisor and all those other roles go, but I've seen so many different financial situations, and my degree is in marketing and public relations. So you could almost do a career that's completely separate from finance if it's not your true thing. But there's, like, so much to be learned if your kid's trying to get a first job, going to work at some sort of a credit union. So many other kids in college also worked there when I did. It was kind of like there's kind of like this niche group at our college that also worked at the credit union.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And I've known even some branch managers. Actually, one guy who was actually oversaw three different branches of US Bank. And he had just worked his way up, from the time that he was younger,
Mhm.
just within the banking system, right? So he started kind of like you did, and then worked his way up. And I mean, so people work their way up into being loan officers at banks and all sorts of stuff.
Mhm.
So just
Yeah.
lots. I think that's a great point you bring, right? It's a great hard to find a better entry level job if you're interested in finance at all. So let's talk about your thoughts about money talking points, right? So you talk a
Mhm.
lot about money. That's kind of your passion, right? Your podcast is focused on getting people to be more comfortable talking about money. So what are things that people should be talking about?
Yeah, and I'm going to plug a free resource that I have. I've put together the 7 money talking points. I call it, like, the baby steps for getting started talking about money. Some of the main ones that I think are really important to talk about is, the first one is, what will I do in an emergency? Because I don't have the stat right off my head, but the majority of Americans can't handle, like, I think it's a $400 emergency
Yeah,
or
it's
something like
crazy.
that. And that's not a lot of money. Like, it might be
Mm-mm.
if you're truly going through, like, a paycheck to paycheck emergency and things like that. $400 could be almost life changing. But when you really get your finances in order, you realize that's not that much money. And you should be able to almost give out $400 if it was required. So,
Yeah.
what will you do in an emergency? That's kind of where I like to start people off, because it kind of gets you to almost, like, snap into reality of, like, shoot, I don't know. I don't know what would happen if my car's tire went flat. And you can kind of figure out where you're actually starting with that questions.
Well, and just to jump in, right, kind of back where you started, right, when talking about the credit union and people asking about their credit cards. I mean, so
Mhm.
what a lot of people do when they don't have that cash is they put it on a credit card. And if
Mhm.
they're really sort of living paycheck to paycheck, now they're forced to carry that balance because they can't just pay it off. right? They
Mm-hmm.
run the risk of then having late fees, which then just sort of adds to that. I mean, so then it becomes this whole downward spiraling cycle instead of, if they understand the basics that you would help people sort of understand about their credit cards and interest rates and all that stuff. If they manage things just a little bit better, it's typically not, if you, with a little bit of discipline over time, it's not, even if you don't have a lot of extra money each month, it's
Mm-hmm.
not that hard to set a little bit of money aside from each paycheck and each month, and have at least a $400 or $500 for a small emergency, so that you're not
Mm-hmm.
stuck then putting yourself into this trap of, oh man, now I'm on a credit card that I already have a payment for, and now it's gone up, and that whole thing. So, sorry, go back to your points
Yeah,
there.
no, that's fantastic. Like even just having that bare bones amount might be able to reduce the amount of credit card debt you will have to carry. Like if it's a true emergency and it's a couple $1,000s, now it's only maybe half that or something like that
Yeah.
if you have a little bit of one. So something great to just consider how you actually manage an emergency. A couple other ones here. I want to get to one that I think is really fun, but a couple other ones just to read what I have here. You can ask yourself, how am I making money? How am I spending money? How am I saving money? Do I want to pay off all my debt? Or that's just understanding what your debt situation looks like. What do you want your retirement to look like? And then the fun one that I love to ask people is my last money talking point here. What are my big money goals? Is it going on a world cruise? Is it taking all of your family on a trip to Disneyland? Like what are those big money goals? Because those are the things that are the exact opposite of what will I do in an emergency. They're what will I do for fun? And those are incredible conversations to have with a spouse or kids in this instance, of what do they want their life to look like in 55 years when they're retiring. How can you set them up now and teach them compound interest now? So they're
Yeah.
just, the money talking points are kind of just eye-opening conversation starters that really make it easy, because sometimes money can be such a hard thing to start that conversation around. So my money talking points, really, I just want to kind of get some conversation primers. But yeah, the what are your big money goals is a fun conversation to have.
Yeah, sure. And one of the things that I can say is, so for a long time, right, I didn't manage my money well, and I made a lot of the classic stupid mistakes, and I'll call them stupid
Mhm.
because I made them. So I don't want to insult anybody else, but I look back and think, man, but having gotten to the other side of that, and then being financially stable and achieve some level of financial independence, and just even that interim stage where you've got a healthy emergency fund and you just have that stability, and you can spend money on other people or on family without having to stress about it. It's not just that it's a nice thing to do, but just personally, from a selfish level, in a sense, it just feels really good. And so, right, so I
Mhm.
think you bring up a great point, having that fun conversation about what do you really want to do with your money, because that gives you that long-term goal and something to really sort of shoot for, right? And you've got to
Mhm.
talk about the other things in the meantime, and have that, and develop the habits and that consistent action over time in order to get there. But if you don't even think that that's something you can achieve, and don't have a vision for it, then you've got no motivation to even work towards it. So
Mhm.
I think that's great. And I think, so for parents talking to their kids, sometimes the long-term stuff, if your kids are younger, can be a little tricky for them to grasp. I
Mhm.
mean, certainly by the time they're later high school or early college, they can start to think about that more. But there's a lot that parents can do with kids even when they're younger. It just makes it's a shorter time frame, right? If it's, what
Mhm.
thing do you want to, whatever they're into, if they're into video games, or they're into,
Mhm.
you've got a teenage daughter that's now starting to get into clothes or jewelry, right? Then you can use those things to help them understand how to plan and develop good
Mhm.
money habits, so that they're learning how to think about money, talk about money with you. And on also, right, this idea of talking about, well, what you want to do, and involving your kids, or talking about it as a family. Then we get back to your whole point that families should really be talking about money,
Mhm.
rather than it's some taboo subject that we never discuss.
Yeah, we definitely need to be talking about money in our families, whether it's just husband and wife or husband, wife, and kids. I think the kids need some exposure to the financial conversations going on. They may not need the whole entire plate of everything going on. They don't need to know how estate planning's working or things like that are maybe
Sure.
more in like extreme detail. But I think just informing them, hey, our electricity budget or our utilities budget is getting a little bit tight. And one of the examples I've heard for a couple times on different podcasts is make it a game, because that's
Okay.
where it can be really fun. Of like, hey, our electricity bill was $300, just to throw a number out there. Let's see if we can get it to 275,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of make it a game of who can turn off the most lights when they were left on or things like that, just to make it more fun, even though they're impacting the money, helping you save money. And then you can kind of share a month later when you get the next bill. Hey, here's our success. We actually went down to 260. Can we push it to 250?
Yeah.
Things like that. And they're just thinking about, oh, this is costing us money, or this doing this saves us money. And it just kind of plants some of those seeds in the back of their mind of money touches everything in our lives, so we have to be aware of it.
Well, that's really cool, right? Because that encompasses so many things. You're teaching them that the expenses for your house, right? Even just the energy for the lights or the heat or
Mhm.
the AC or whatever, that stuff's not free. It's not magic, right? You have to
Yeah,
pay for
I wish
that,
it
which is
was.
something they're not aware of. So they're learning it, but in a fun way, right?
Mhm.
And also then it just kind of creates awareness about sort of things in the house. And you're talking about money in a way that's not too in depth if you've got kids that are younger, but that they can still start to grasp. And this is something that's come up on some of our episodes in the past, is just the idea of modeling, right? Parents modeling for
Mhm.
their kids. Hey, we're thinking about this and we're doing it all together. So no, I think those kind of things are great ideas.
Yeah, examples are super fun. And one of the things you and I talked about before that I think is in the same vein is giving the kids a budget to manage.
Yes.
I think it's in the same vein of having that conversation with them of here's how you manage a budget. You give them one category. This is the method I like to try to teach is give them one category that they have full control over. If they spend it all, they spend it all. If they save it, then they can use it the next month.
Right.
Things like that, just to teach them some simple techniques of how do you handle money, how do you allocate money for different expenses while the month's still going, think about future purchases, things like that that can be done on a really simple level. Because the great way to do it is have them make a $300 mistake before they have to make a $30,000 mistake, where
Yeah.
you can teach them when it's a little bit less impactful and you can sustain that blow for them, versus trying to help them get out of an auto loan debt that they should have never found themselves in.
Yeah, right. Yep, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about kind of dive into a little bit of the specifics of the financial independence retire early movement, right?
Mhm.
So, because one of the things that I, one of my goals with this show is to help parents get their kids started early so that if their kids want to decide that they want to reach financial independence when they're far before traditional retirement age, so even as early as their 30s or 40s, like some people have done
Mhm.
when they figured it out early. I mean, not every person is going to want to do that, but my hope would be that if parents understand financial independence, they're working towards it themselves or have gotten there and they're trying to teach their kids, that they give their kids the habits and skills that they can make that choice if they want to. So let's just
Mhm.
talk a little bit about the financial independence movement and then how that kind of fits in with what parents can be teaching their kids, some of which we've already covered, right? Which is, kind of just getting them started on these habits. The
Mhm.
budget idea obviously is great. I think I also like to recommend that they start their kids doing some sort of savings, right? And teach them
Mhm.
early the habit of living on less than you make, because right, that's that whole thing about, if you it's not just that you save to save. The whole idea of saving, and you mentioned this before, right? And we're talking about credit cards, is your whatever money you have left, you want to invest that and make it start working for you. So
Mhm.
I don't know. What are your thoughts about fire?
Yeah. Yeah, the first thought my mind goes to is implementing some sort of simple rule of thumb with your kids, like the 50/30/20 type of budget with just any income they get. Just teach them to save 20%, because if they can keep a 20% savings rate their whole life, they're set. Like they're going to be just fine. But also, one of the things for parents to consider, especially if you have very young children, you might be able to, if you're in a good financial situation or if you're already financially independent, you might be able to make your kid coast fi from day one,
Mm,
where that money will be what they need to retire on when they get there to retirement, because that compounding interest can work so well. So that's just a thought to plant in the back of parents' minds, is if you're doing really well financially, you might be able to completely set your kids up with a small amount of money, like one to a few $1,000s could compound to enough for them to retire on when they reach 65, which is so long in their future. So that's just something to consider. But
yeah.
I like the idea of using a rule of don't try to make it too complex for kids.
Mm,
The 50/30/20, save 20%. I think it's 50% to needs and then 30% to wants. But something like that can just help them get down the path of actually thinking about using their money for different things other than just spending.
Yeah.
Because I remember when I was a kid, my first job, I was always like, oh, one more paycheck till I can buy this. And then my account would go to zero because the only thing I knew to do with money was spend it. And then
Yeah, that's
once
right.
the switch flipped to, hey, if I save some, then I can get bigger things later. And then if I just keep saving it, and then I realize I don't need that thing. So if you kind of can start planting those seeds in their mind earlier with some sort of structure around it, I think that's going to prove ultimately the most helpful towards getting them on a financial independence path.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that completely. So just to back up for a second, just to clarify for anybody who's not familiar. So FIRE is financial independence, retire early. And it kind of started with know yourself so that you
Mhm.
can have a life that you enjoy, but you're not spending money on anything that really doesn't add
Mhm.
that much value. And then you take as much as you can and save it and invest it, make it grow for you. And the more you can dump into investing, the sooner and the more you can do that, then the earlier you can achieve financial independence, right?
Mhm.
And that financial independence is sort of driven by the 4% rule. And so that's why it ties in with knowing, being able to keep your expenses down. So, but as that's sort of gone on, that didn't necessarily work for everybody. I say often, right, there's no one path to fire. It's got to be very
Mhm.
individualized, a little different for everybody. And you mentioned Coast Fire.
Mhm.
So why don't you talk about what Coast FI is versus sort of traditional, sort of full on FI?
Yeah. Coast fire, from my perspective, means your retirement is set. You're going to be okay because of the power of compound interest. So, for example, the number is much smaller. Like the 4% rule, $1 million portfolio would get you about $40,000 a year, versus racing to that $1 million portfolio can be very hard and challenging. And that's where people can live a little bit of a life of deprivation.
Mm-hmm.
Versus if you wanted to retire on, I don't know the math because it's much more complicated to do Coast Fi, but let's say your Coast Fi number was only like 250, $300,000, you can get to that a lot easier. And then you know that that amount is going to grow over time, especially if you start younger, that number is going to be even smaller. That number is going to grow to what you need it on that set retirement day, say 65. There's a lots of great Coast Fi calculators out there that'll run the numbers for you because it can be, it's hard to do in your head versus just 25 times your expenses is easy
Yeah.
with regular fire. But Coast Fi is going to allow people to take a step back. It's what my wife and I are going for right now, because for us, going for full fire is a big number and that's a little bit scary. So we're like, hey, let's get to Coast Fire first. Let's push to that and see how we're feeling. Then we know we're good. Like, let's say me and my wife love our jobs and we don't want to retire early. If we have Coast Fi in place, we theoretically could spend 100% of our income and know our retirement's going to be okay. Now, we won't want to do that because retiring earlier still sounds nice to us, but Coast Fi allows you to kind of take a little bit of a step back because you're coasting to financial independence, because your compound interest in the background and your investments are working for you so that they're going to meet the needs you have when you need them. So
Yeah.
it's just unlocks a wealth of opportunities.
Well, and so it to me, it's right. So instead of it's sort of an all out sprint to get there as soon as you can, and then you can be done if you want. And that means, and again, right, people
Mhm.
who, let's say someone achieves, they really just go sort of, full bore, and
Mhm.
they're at financial independence by the time they're 35. And if they still love their job, they can keep doing that. If they want to sort of switch gears, they can. I mean, or they don't have to work, they can do whatever they want. So Coast FI is a slower roll, and so part of what you're
Mhm.
talking about, right? If you with that smaller portfolio and letting it grow over time, is another rule another rule with a number name, which is the rule of 72, which is if you take
Mhm.
your projected um, interest rate, right? So let's
Mhm.
say if you've got your money invested in the stock market, a whole money or a whole market fund, let's say, and the stock market over time returns about 8%. The rule of 72 is divide 72 by the 8%. That gives you nine. And the way that that works is in theory, your money would double every 9 years if you're earning 8%. Now,
Mhm.
it's not that straightforward because, right, the market returns 8% on average over time. Some years it might lose money,
Mhm.
some years it makes a lot more. But again, if it's Coast Fire and you're looking at a longer stretch of time, then you can use that as a way to sort of anticipate, well, great, I've got $250,000 I've already kind of got in here. And if I just let that sort of double in 9 years and then double again another nine
Mhm.
years after that. And what it does, I think, is it frees you up to have more money to spend now, or it frees you up to, if you have a job where you're making good money and you're trying to throw a lot into your investments, but you're really unhappy in that job,
Mm-hmm.
you can then step back, do Coast FI, where now I'm not trying to sock so much money in. I'm just going to let this grow, and I can get a different job, or maybe I make less, but I'm happier and I'm less frustrated with whatever it was you were frustrated with in your other job. So,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. That's a specific point that I think a lot of people like, is that they're high earning jobs. Coastfy allows them to take a little bit of a step back to do something that they enjoy more. I recently on my podcast had the Coastfy couple on, and Matt from the Coastfy couple was in that exact position. He was burnt out, he was tired, but they realized, hey, we're very close to Coastfy. Let's go ahead and pull the trigger. You can find a job you enjoy a little bit more. He took a break for a period of time.
Yeah.
Like, it just allows you so many opportunities that if you're paycheck to paycheck, you can't even really dream of, because you can't get to sleep because you can't sleep because your money is in such a bad situation, kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So there's so many opportunities that Coastify just unlocks for you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Right. And again, right, if parents can be teaching their kids these things when they're younger and helping them understand how it all works. And then, as kids sort of get out on their own and they're in their early 20s, I mean, most everyone makes mistakes at that point, which is fine. But if they've got
Mhm.
parents that they're already used to talking about money, right, and that's the way that they've grown up, then they have someone who can help guide them and help them problem solve, and then they can kind of get themselves back on track. And someone that they can help talk things through with, to sort of figure out what's the right way to continue moving towards financial independence for them. Because
Mhm.
again, right, to me, it's like a puzzle, and you're always trying to match up, well, how do I maximize the money that I'm investing, but how do I increase my income or not, or where can I decrease expenses, but what do I really does matter to me and I don't want to give up, and what's the right puzzle for me. And it continues to change as you
Mhm.
age. So starting the idea of talking about money in your home early, so that kids are
Mhm.
comfortable with that and they're comfortable talking with you, the parents, I think just pays dividends,
Yeah. Pun intended.
down the line. So, yeah. Okay. Um, so let's talk a little bit about behavioral finance.
Mhm. Yeah,
So,
it's the only reason we're talking about this, because, sorry to jump in here. One of the things I like to say is, if money was just math, we'd have it all calculated out. Like, there's all
yeah.
these rules, there's all these percentages. If behavioral finance didn't exist, money would be easy. So it's the only reason we're actually talking about all this, is because there's behavior involved and human, like, interactions and stuff.
So what does that mean? So give us a explanation of behavioral finance and how that, and what you do in term when you've got people that you're coaching, right? How
Mhm.
you work that into what you're working with them on.
Yeah, a personal story here of my wife and I trying to figure out how to pay off her student loans. Okay. I am very math oriented. I'm the spreadsheet nerd in our relationship, hence why I'm the one who's talking about money and stuff like that. And
Mhm.
my wife helps keep me grounded with helping me realize some of the behavioral and emotional aspects of money with her student loans. We were fortunate to come out in a position where she didn't have a whole ton of student loans. And thankfully, that allowed us to be in a better position. And I wanted to draw out paying those off because the interest wasn't too much. We could earn just about the same amount of interest in a regular high yield account
Mhm.
or more investing. So I was looking at opportunity costs and things like that, and looking at the math, saying, mathematically, if we did it this way, it could be better for us. And she comes to me crying. I'm like, why are you crying? What's wrong with this? This plan's great. We're going to have a lot of money. And she said, as long as we have those loans, I feel like I have to work. And
Yeah.
speaking to financial independence, that's not usually a plan in financial independence, is being forced to work because of debt. So that clicked with me. I'm like, oh, well, there we go. We have to pay them off. Like, it wasn't even a debate for me at that point, because of that behavioral aspect of the requirement for her to have to be in a high earning job because of her master's degree and things like that until the loans were paid off. So just to even, she's not saying she's going to quit her job as soon as they get paid off, but just to have that breathing room of, hey, I need to take a year off, and I can do that because we don't owe any debt on what was my education for this job. So I think that's a great example of it that my wife and I had to work through, of there's so much more to it than just the math, and the emotions can play a huge role in it.
Yeah, well, and then they play into sort of just how you feel otherwise, and that's gonna like you keep saying, right? Money, it affects all the different areas of our lives, right? So if you're stressed about the money, then that's going to sort of carry over into sort of other things and other decisions. And then you may find that you're
Hmm.
spending money on things that are really kind of more of a distraction because you're not really dealing with kind of this other root cause of some sort of
Hmm.
economic anxiety. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. And just to kind of go back to and add a little bit to what you're saying, right? So I, from a strictly math point of view, right? Strictly the numbers. So let's
Hmm.
say you guys have student loans, and let's say the interest rate on those student loans was 5%, right? So currently, right, you could put that money into a high yield savings account or a high yield CD and make the same
Hmm.
amount. So why pay off the loan when you can make the same? Or if you invested that money somewhere where you're earning 8%, you're actually still 3% ahead of paying off
Hmm.
those loans. That's the strict math, right?
Hmm.
But then you get into, but man, if it's stressing her out,
Hmm.
mathematically speaking,
That's like a negative 20% interest
yeah.
rate if my wife's stressed.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and it's not worth it, right? I mean, because
hmm.
again, the whole point of the money is to give you a better life. It's a tool,
Hmm.
right? So if it makes
Yeah.
more sense, like, we'll do this for a short period of time, even though mathematically it's not ideal, but so what, right? We'll make it up on the other side of
Hmm.
things. And like, this is going to make us feel better, then do that. So I think that
Hmm.
is a great example of behavioral finance versus just straight numbers.
Yeah, and it can be so hard for my fellow math nerds out there. You know the power of compound interest, and you know saying,
Mm.
let's get the money in sooner so it's invested sooner so that it can grow more over time and then we can pay off the loans. Like that was a real struggle for me because I'm like, we have to get it in there. Like I waited through her going through graduate school and stuff like that, and I'm like, okay, that makes sense. We need to save some money while she's going through graduate school so we can reduce our student loan amount. But now that we can paint out a plan for how to pay these off, that's going to take a little bit longer, but we can get more invested now because she's earning higher and things like that. It was really hard for me because I'm like, the math makes so much sense to invest it. And and thankfully through talking about it, we realized, okay, we need to pay these off a little sooner. And we found ourselves in a position now where we're like, oh, because of the effort we put on the front end, these numbers are smaller. So actually we can pay it off in 2 years by using a smaller amount than we thought we would need.
Cool.
So there comes the money that we're able to invest where we thought we were going to need more to pay off these loans. So just, I guess, working hard and actually talking through it, you're going to realize opportunities that it's all going to be fine. Like we're going to have enough money to retire. We're going to retire early. We're not worried about that. Is it maybe 1 year later than it would have been, but we're able to enjoy life more now? That's an easy decision every single time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely right. And again, that's back to that's that puzzle, and you've got to sort of plan it
Mhm.
out. I mean, and you again, another point, right? Like behavioral finance isn't just about you, it's about, right, in your case, right, you and your wife, right, how
Mhm.
you what makes sense for the two of you together. And right, and people always sort of see things a little bit differently, and you've got to take all that into account. And that same thing is going to be true with families and what's going on with their kids. Or again, the example of like, well, helping your young adult kids, right, like, and if you've
Mhm.
got a couple of adult kids, how they're going to interact and deal with money is likely to be different. So you might have one who's a
Mhm.
big saver and who's like, nah, cruising right along, and the other that, it's going to be more of an ongoing conversation and you're having to help them sort things out more. But that's just kind of part of being a
Yeah.
parent. But again, it's back to this whole idea of, you know, money is so much more than just the math, just the numbers,
Mhm.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
you've got to have that, you've got to have that knowledge base so you can make smart decisions, but the optimal decision will always vary a little bit. And then it brings in these
Mhm.
other components that are more than just the money, right? Because you're still living a life.
Yeah. And if there's one thing that we know for sure about like rules of thumb, like the 4% rule and things like that, it's that they're going to be wrong because there's behavioral aspects to it.
Yeah.
Like it's a guideline for us to set up the math against, but then we got to say, what does our life actually look like racing to financial independence? Is it pure deprivation? Oh, that's not fun. Is it getting racing to coast fi with maybe much less time depriving ourselves, and then we get to relax and go on a nice vacation because our income will open up. So there's so many different aspects, and that's what's fun about talking about money or coaching money or things like that, is when you allow people to see that they have options,
Yeah.
it just becomes a fun conversation. And that's when people say, oh yeah, money's not a hard thing to manage, it's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Once you start to
Mhm.
understand it and get a little bit of control of it, I think that's absolutely true.
Mhm.
Right. It is fun because then you start to see, oh man, like the power of how you can make it work for you,
Hmm.
and not feel like you have to be trapped into any one thing. Have you read Die with Zero by Bill Perkins?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, I
right.
have.
And so, kind of the idea there, and you can chime in however you see fit here, right? But the idea is that as you're sort of managing your finances and putting money together and sort of planning for your future, you also still have to live now. And that certain
Hmm.
things are really sort of best enjoyed, and really you can only take advantage of, or best take advantage of at certain ages, right? Like
Hmm.
I had a great time in my 20s and traveled a lot, and hitchhiked around Europe and spent one winter as a ski bum sort of living out of the back of my truck. And you know what, those were great experiences. I would never consider doing that stuff now, but
Hmm.
I'm glad I did it then. And I think that proves true in all sorts of ways. So this idea of finding the right balance for you between, I still want to live my life and enjoy my life, and we want to enjoy our life together as a family or as a couple or whatever it might be, and how do we look at it all together? So I think your idea of, right, these different concepts like the 4% rule are good guidelines to give you
Hmm.
a way to plan, but then you've still got to maintain flexibility and allow yourself creativity around that, so that again,
Hmm.
you're crafting a life both now and in the future that's bringing you the most amount of joy and fulfillment.
Yeah, and on the note of the Die with Zero book, one of the things that I'm working to become a CFP right now, so to become a
Cool.
financial planner, and I'm going through this like uh, first like perspective. I'm trying to think of the case studies
Oh
like
yeah.
course. I'm going through this course like watching case studies of this planner work with these couples, and one of the funnest things he gets to do, and this is common in the financial independence space, we save too much money, and that's where the Die with Zero book comes into play. Is he's telling these people, he's like, what would it look like for you to be able to spend $270,000 a year and be fine through the rest of your retirement? And they're like, what do you mean? Like, we can't do that. And then he's like, no, here's the numbers, you can. And I just think that's a whole nother aspect of that behavioral finance that's so fun. Is like if you're in a situation to help your, let's say like that example you used with your young adult children, one's a saver, one's a spender. Maybe you tell the one that's a saver, here's $3,000. You are not allowed to save it. You have to spend this money. Or you give the spender, here's $3,000. Can I show you how to open up a Roth IRA? Things like that. Like maybe you can use that money in a fun way to help teach some of those behavioral aspects of here's how you save, and here's how you set up this account, or here's how you spend the money, go do something fun,
Yeah. Yeah.
because you have enough in the background to be okay.
Yeah, and go live, right? Like have some
Hmm.
experiences. Absolutely. Right. Because
Yeah.
one of the other things that I thought was really cool in Die with Zero is his idea of what did he call it? Um something memory, like experience memory. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So when you, gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the term he used, but basically the idea is, right. So I gave that example of being, a ski bum for a winter, and living out of the back of my truck and stuff. Yeah, I look back on that, even though I would never do it again now, but I look back on it and I still get to enjoy those memories, and it brings up sort of positive
Hmm.
feelings. And that's true with all sorts of different experiences that we have. I mean, all anybody has to do is think of a couple of things from your past, and you're like, you get those good feelings again.
Hmm.
And so if you've, back to your example, right, of the kid who's a big saver, I think that's a great idea, right? A great strategy for them. Like, here, take this money, and you're not allowed to save it. Go spend it, to
Hmm.
help them understand you also have to live now. You
Hmm.
can't just always be living for the future, because we just
Yeah.
don't, you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and once you realize that, it gets a lot more fun, because then you start to notice
Yeah.
those opportunities to live. Like my wife and I had a work trip for my day job in Tampa. My wife was able to come for a few days, and then we stayed one extra day and drove to Disney World,
Cool.
where we only stayed there till like 4 p.m. because then we had to catch a flight that night. We were so exhausted when we got home, because my wife, for part of her clinical rotations, the morning we got home at 3 a.m., she had to be to the hospital at 6 a.m. So
Oh
she was just
goodness.
hoping she got a good sleep on the flight.
Yeah.
Like those kind of things. In 10 years, there's no shot we would do that. Like there's no way. But that's such a memory that we're gonna like. Remember the time we had so much fun in Disney World for 8 hours? Like we couldn't even stay that long. We were literally like speed walking between rides to try to
Yeah.
get the things we wanted. We were in one of the rides, they had to do that virtual queue, and the virtual queue was like right before the time we needed to leave, and we're like, we're pushing it, and we did. And like there was so many things in that trip that were just so much fun, because we utilized the ability we have now to withstand that kind of stress, or like
Yeah.
push our bodies through that kind of experience where we're racing in a hot day in a theme park to an airport, things like that. Like,
Hmm.
it's just so much fun once you start to open up those opportunities and spend a little bit of money now.
Yeah. No, I think that's great, right? That intensity sometimes in life, especially when you're younger, it just adds a lot to your enjoyment and just your experience.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys had that together, right? So that's again, like you're going to always remember that and you'll be able to look back
Mm-hmm.
on that fondly.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think what you're referring to, I think in that book he talks about how our memories multiply and like grow over time, and if we're able to use just a little bit of money to get that going, it's going to pay dividends in terms of like a money memory kind of thing.
Here's a question. What what do you wish that you had known about money when you were younger?
The main thing I think I wish I would have known, I mean, compound interest is the obvious one, but there's everyone will say that I wish I would have invested sooner, things like that, but
Yeah.
that's kind of such a basic answer. I think the thing that I wish I would have known sooner is how to just start the conversations, how to ask my friends, hey, do you have a credit card? There was one of my friends in high school that I think a couple years after high school, he knew I was starting to get interested in money, and he mentioned how his parents had him investing in VTI since he was like 13. And I was like, I wish I would have asked you about that when we were 13, because we'd all be so much richer if
Yeah.
you would have shared that knowledge, but maybe he didn't know how to talk about it. So just being able to know that those conversations are okay. And I think that comes from parents introducing it as well. Like, maybe the parent doesn't know how to do everything with a 529 or HSAs and all the little details that you'll hear all the podcasters talk about, but they do know that it's easy to start with simple investing, and they can kind of talk that about that with their kids, and just kind of priming that pump, I think a little bit sooner would have been great, because then you're able to get ahead on that compound interest and stuff like that.
That's a great point because kids talk to each other about so many different things. And I
Hmm.
was talking to somebody just recently, we were talking about reading and about books. And I had a friend when I was in junior high and high school, and that was a lot of kind of what tied us together is right as we talked about, we were both like to read and we were into science fiction and fantasy. And we talked about that stuff a lot. And that kind of fuses together with another thing that's been on my mind lately, right? Is I've heard Scott Galloway say people that grow up not wealthy, there's this taboo we have, like not to talk about money. But he said rich people talk
Hmm.
about money all the time, right?
Yeah,
That's
and
like the
like,
dirty little secret. They talk, oh, what are you investing in? What are you this? What are you that? Kind of like with
mhm,
your friend, right? Not that he was necessarily rich, but the thing is if all of us talked about money, to your point and the whole point of your podcast,
mhm.
right? If we talked about money all the time, if kids talked about money the way that they talked about
Video games and
Instagram
things
or
like that.
video
Yeah.
games or yeah, whatever, then right, it would open more things up. So
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know. Interesting. That's a really interesting point to me.
Yeah, and for some, like you said, if you're poor, you tend to think you can't talk about money because maybe you're a little scared to share.
Yeah, sure.
But that could be just a point to ask questions, especially if you feel like someone in your life, you feel like, hey, it seems like they're doing all right with money. Maybe I can ask them a question. Like, I think one thing I've found is that most people who are doing well with money love to share. They love to
Yeah.
talk about it. They don't want to, like, I always tell my listeners, don't like shove it down people's throats that saying you need to do better with money, because that's just rude. But like, be
Sure.
willing to have the conversations. And more often than not, if you're doing comfortable with money, I would, if someone came and asked me and said, how do you pay off your credit cards, I would literally probably show them on my screen. Like, it's fine
Hmm.
to show that sort of stuff because you're comfortable with it, because you have control over it, and they can see that, hey, there's probably a couple $1,000s on one of my credit cards because it has a 0% transfer bonus, and I'm taking advantage of it to pay for something else. And then I can open up that conversation. I'll be like, what, you're carrying credit card debts? Like, I am, but because of this other thing I'm in control of. All those sort of conversations just open up, and I'm willing to share that with people. And then they'll be like, wow, there are situations where it's okay to carry credit card debt and things like that that they just wouldn't ever realize. So there's so many fun conversations. And if they're comfortable with their money and in control of it, I found most of them will love to talk about it and share, like you said.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Because I feel the same way, right? Because once you kind of get a handle on your money and you understand the basics and you realize, oh, how good it feels to sort of have some financial
Hmm.
stability and feel like, oh, I can make money work for me, then you're happy to share that with other people because you want them
Hmm.
to have that same sense of control and that ability to sort of move forward and create kind of more sort of joy and opportunities for experiences and whatever it is in their lives. So yeah, absolutely. That's a great
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a sorry, there's like that principle about sharing good knowledge you find, like a biblical principle almost. And I think it applies to money as well, that once you start to figure out how to control it, then you have to go out there and share it. And that's like what I was saying in the beginning, is it's almost an obligation at this point to share it with other people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. That's really fantastic. So any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I guess final thoughts for parents, since this is a Five for Kids podcast. If you're a parent, learn the math so that you can show it to your kids. And maybe even, I love the idea of, I've heard it so many times, of doing some sort of a parental match into an IRA. That way your kid only has to contribute half the amount and you contribute the other half if they're able to max out their IRA. Things like that, I think, are such great opportunities, especially if you're listening to Financial Independence Podcast. You're probably in control with your money. You're probably starting to get on that good path where you do have a little bit more of that flexibility. And my wife and I don't have kids right now, but like those sort of opportunities just excite me like crazy, because to think about the leg up that you'll be able to give your kids, and when you can teach them the right principles and everything behind it, and knowing they'll be able to carry on the wealth and things like that, that's just honestly where it gets fun. So for parents, learn those little opportunities that can go a long way because of compounding interest for your kids.
That's great. So your podcast, people, you should check it out. Skyler does a great job. He's got a lot of interesting people on. He's got people that are sort of versed in the FI world. And so just it's another great resource for information about finances and financial literacy and financial independence. So Money Talk with Skyler Fleming, and you can find that at all your usual sort of podcast places. Yep. Where else can they find you if anybody's interested in your coaching stuff, or how else can people get a hold of you, Skyler?
Yeah, my website's the same thing. It's a long URL, but it's moneytalkwithskylerfleming.com. So if you search me on any sort of social media, you'll find me as well. It all links back to my website. I love to do these free money talks with people. So if you have a question, like, just ask me. I love to talk to people about money. So if you're feeling maybe a little scared to talk to your friends about your credit card debt, come and chat with me. I love to have these sort of money talks, and they usually lead to great stories. But my podcast is usually I talk to an expert in some sort of field. And then the thing I like to do is the money talking points for that episode. So I'll break down the interview into some money talking points that you can take and go ask your friends about, to kind of just take little pieces of the interview and apply it to your life and talk about it. So, because that's really what it's all about. It's just talking about money.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Skyler, for coming on. And again, everybody, I'll put his information in the show notes, and you should check out the podcast.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the FI for Kids podcast. Please support the show by hitting subscribe and receive new episodes every Thursday. The intro and exit music this episode are courtesy of Douglas Cameron. As always, you can find links to the FI for Kids music in the show notes. Thanks again, and we'll talk next week.
You're like the horizon. I can't reach you, you're so far away. And if I run to the place I want you to stay, you'd be gone. I'd be left wondering why you moved on, and why you never said goodbye. I can't wait any longer. I see the writing on the wall. It's time for us to say, tomorrow we are yesterday. Tomorrow we are yesterday. You're like the sunset. You're glowing bright, but you're fading. And what I don't get is why I'm left here waiting. But I'm like a phoenix. I